Hello.
Hi.
The last time we spoke about the three of the five of us not going to the Kingdom Hall anymore. So our study group, now we had Steve, who was stumbled by Rutherford, and we had GP being stumbled by boredom, really. But I didn't realize how much of an impact it was having on David, these issues.
I told Vivian during that summer that I must resign as an elder. At the very least, take a hiatus and take some time off. We had had a brief honeymoon.
Yeah, finally, after 4 years of marriage, we took some time to have a honeymoon.
Finally, we did that, thinking that might help a little bit, but it didn't. It didn't, because after all, you realized all of these issues that were now coming up were causing me consternation. I felt I had to have time to reevaluate a lot of things, and I couldn't do it while I was serving as an elder, publicly advocating the Watchtower's positions and interpretations continually, while starting to have these serious doubts myself.
A crisis of conscience.
Yeah. So in the fall of 1986, I resigned as an elder. Mm-hmm. You didn't worry too much about it at that point.
No, I thought it was reasonable to think that you could take some time off and assess, reevaluate, firm up. You know, for me, I just thought he was just going to firm up his beliefs, find out the answers, and then we would go merrily on our way again. So
yeah.
I was not expecting what happened.
The snowball effect, yeah.
Yeah.
But the good part of all of this was that we, as a group of five, definitely dedicated ourselves to studying the book of Genesis in detail, week after week for months, best part of a year.
Right.
But what we turned up in the book of Genesis was edifying for sure, strengthening for sure our faith in the Bible and in the God who inspired it, but a lot of surprises.
Yes.
And the first of the surprises involved the structure of the book. Because when you're a Jehovah's Witness, you have a certain set of impressions of what Genesis is about. And they tend to be the same impressions that Christians have of the book of Genesis.
It's about creation or the flood or
the fall of man.
Yeah, the sin.
The Tower of Babel. And Abraham, of course, you know he's in there. But you don't realize that all of that makes up just about a quarter of the book.
Right.
The first 11 chapters of Genesis are devoted to the build-up to the life of Abraham, and then the rest of the book, the rest of the structure of Genesis, is wrapped around a 250-year period, 3 generations really, going into a fourth. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his offspring is the rest of the book. So even the proportions are a surprise to you when you really start to work through chapter by chapter of the book and realize you're embedded in stories you're not that familiar with. By the time you're into the Genesis 20s and 30s, you're into stories that are much less familiar to you than the earlier part of the narrative.
If anything, you might remember Joseph from Genesis, but Jacob's life, it seems very minor, and yet it's covering so many chapters.
So all of that prehistory dealt with in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. The creation account, the fall, everything up to Abraham, thousands of years, and according to some Christian interpreters, millions of years, is dealt with in the first 11 chapters. And then the rest of the 40 chapters is dealing with
a family.
One family.
A messy family.
And 250 years. Here's some stats that you might be interested in, that based on the New World Translation Study Edition. If in that edition there's 68 pages of Genesis, guess how much is devoted to the creation and fall? 4 pages. 5 pages dedicated to the primitive world and the flood, and then another 3.5 pages of the period from the flood to Abram. That's it. So about 20% of the whole book given to primeval history, including all those important subjects.
The ones we tend to concentrate on.
Yeah, and maybe the reason that we don't find the rest of Genesis that interesting, certainly, is because we don't find it edifying.
Yes. It's not like all good positive, upbuilding stories about heroic figures. It's actually about non-heroic figures, people who lack faith or mess up their lives in major ways. Decisions they make.
One very dysfunctional family. The descendants of Abraham on one side. That's the side that's followed. The royal side of the family that leads up to Messiah. That's the dysfunctional family we're talking about, not the guys outside the family.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, you realize, okay, it's not just that only 1/4 or less of the book is dedicated to all the familiar subjects of Genesis, but the last half of it is given over to the story of Jacob. And of the royal family in its descent, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, who's the least likable character? Who's the least heroic character? Jacob.
Is Jacob.
And yet he gets half of Genesis.
Yeah.
And that's for two reasons, I believe. One, to show us, first of all, that this is really not about the royal family. It's not about figures of faith even. Abraham is there, and we think of the faith of Abraham.
Right.
But Abraham messes up too. So does Isaac. And then Jacob, his life is almost one long disaster. And that's part of the reason we end up with Joseph and being a hero at the end. He saves them from the disaster. Or he's the one.
So the focus ends up being on God's faithfulness rather than men's faithfulness or lack of it. It's, you start to see a vivid demonstration of God's faithfulness in spite of people being people.
So if you think of Genesis, at least the big stories that we all remember, the first 11 chapters, the creation, sin, the flood, Babel, if you think of all of that as somehow testifying to the greatness of God, the rest of Genesis witnesses to the grace of God. And it becomes about God's grace rather than man's faithfulness.
Yeah. So in the past, when I was a witness, the only time I heard about grace in the biblical sense was when people would share with me the scripture about grace from
Ephesians
the New
2.
Testament, Ephesians 2. But when I read Genesis, the book of Genesis, for the first time I could see God's grace in action in the lives of people. It wasn't just a doctrine or a teaching. It was real life example. And considering who is the prime example in Genesis, not a very nice character a lot of the time.
A deceiver.
Yeah, that makes you think, wow, if God can show grace to this person, surely he can show grace to me. And I'm grateful that he can show grace to me then.
So although most of the story is about Jacob and his messy family, Joseph's story being part of that messy family, the murderous brethren want to get rid of their brother and deceive their father in the process. But by the time you get Jacob and the whole family down in Egypt, and Jacob starts to look back over his 130-year life, although he says in front of Pharaoh, "Few and miserable are my days." Well, we could wish we had 130 miserable days, years of life. But he says that. He looks on his life that way. But on the other hand, he says this about God, right? We wanted to read a scripture from Genesis chapter 48, where he's blessing his grandsons that he's just met, Manasseh and Ephraim. Joseph has brought them in to meet him, and he puts his hands on them and blesses them, although not in the way Joseph thought he would. But then he says this.
So it's Genesis 48, 15 and 16. And he proceeded to bless Joseph and say, "The true God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the true God, who has been shepherding me during all my existence until this day, the angel who has been recovering me from all calamity, bless the boys, and let my name be called upon them, and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and let them increase to a multitude in the midst of the earth."
Well, this blessing, this prophecy comes true. This becomes the great nation that Abraham had been told would come out of his loins. And yet you can see, looking back, Jacob thinks of his days as being in the shepherding of God, but when you read the story when he was a younger man, you don't get the sense that he thinks God is with him. You think he has to He
It's-
thinks he has to set it up his own way.
Yeah, he's constantly trying to manipulate things to make it turn out the way he thinks it should turn out because of God's promises. But it's all through his own efforts. I think it's only life experience that at the end of his life he sees the hand of God has been with him all the time, even when he didn't think he was with him. He was with him.
So if you look at Genesis as the record of man's faithfulness to God, the record of righteous men that are there to edify us and give us a good example, you realize that Genesis doesn't do that most of the time.
No.
It's not about man's faithfulness. And if you think about Genesis or the Bible in moral terms, that the Bible exists to show us people with a morality that we can emulate or aspire to, Genesis isn't the book for you.
Yeah.
Because the book is about God's faithfulness and not about ours.
Yeah.
So in the next segment we want to share also some more surprises that we discovered in our study over the period of months in our Bible study in Genesis.